Hey y'all, it's Kay here. What's up? What's up?
Hey everyone, it's Chai.
Hi, as you guys know, I am Rye, your favorite loaf.
And thank you all for coming today. We're going to talk more about what we touched upon on Monday during our special rebroadcast. And on that day, we discussed biracial, multi-ethnic individuals and their acceptance and or rejection from South Korean and Japanese societies. We talked about Naomi Osaka, specifically Yoo Min-rae, and many more. And we dipped into national identity and the complex conversations surrounding national identity and its relationship to feelings of belonging. So definitely check that out if you haven't done so already.
So what today's conversation is going to be like is a little bit of an expansion on that. So as Kay has mentioned, we were talking a lot about biracial individuals. We touched on topics such as like colorism, racism, and as Kay said, whether or not they have a belonging in a national culture. But today's conversation, we want to talk about the presence of foreigners in general in these societies, South Korea and Japan. This topic is particularly relevant to us because, as you all know, we are all foreigners. But we also have particularly cultivated interests and goals involving these countries. We've all each have actually spent some time in Asia, particularly Japan, South Korea, and even China. And so we're going to be talking about, as foreigners, our own positionalities, be it race, national identity, gender, or any other our identities that intersect in our experiences in these countries. So we're going to dive in deeper into identities and what it means being a foreigner in these spaces.
Yes, and I think that this conversation is actually it can get a lot more kind of nitty gritty than even just people who look noticeably different from Korean and Japanese people like we do. But I think this can also relate back to previous conversations about K-pop and the complex political relationship between Japan and South Korea in particular, how that plays into cultural landscapes of today. On the special rebroadcast on Monday, we did mention this recent, semi-recent Japanese Nike ad. And one aspect of that ad that I found particularly interesting, and one that was actually very controversial about it, was this very sensitive representation of a Zainichi Korean. If you people watching this right now have not seen the recent Japanese ad featuring three maybe high school aged girls in Japan, all suffering from bullying for different reasons, I definitely recommend that you go watch that, because I think personally I feel that it was really well done, and I think a lot of what we're going to talk about can be drawn back to issues raised in that ad. But for a lot of people, the term Zainichi Korean is very unfamiliar, particularly for people in America. We don't really have that conversation. And this particular identity is very complex. It relates back to World War II. It relates to Japanese occupation of South Korea. And in particular, Zainichi Korean refers to the ethnic Koreans that migrated to Japan during Japanese occupation in the 1900s. And I believe that the term Zainichi in Japanese implies like a temporary resident, but it is nowadays used almost exclusively to refer to these Koreans who can trace their lineage back that far. And why this is so important in our conversations, and should be a conversation that is maybe had more on a global scale, is because these Korean migrants have now, they're a few generations along, right? And so you can have high schoolers now who have never set foot in Korea. They maybe they don't even know the Korean language. I believe that some of them, some Zainichi Koreans have kind of their own way of speaking Korean, although not all of them, obviously. But Japanese is, for many of them, their native language. It's their home in Japan, and they are legally citizens. And so to be constantly referred to as an outsider, and to also be considered that on a legal level. In fact, I don't know if my fellow podcasters know about this, but pretty recently there was a Japanese politician that got into a lot of trouble for essentially threatening Zainichi Koreans and saying that they should be attacked and that they were very like less than like ethnic Japanese citizens. They got in trouble for it, which doesn't mean that it should have ever been said at all, you know. But this gets into the kind of complicated relationship between what we've talked about before with K-pop and how K-pop utilizes a lot of Japanese talent, and how K-pop is also very popular in Japan. And the ways that political relationship is circumvented through media, right? There's definitely a different idea of Japan when you are a K-pop idol. It becomes one of the most important music markets for you to break into, right? Because Japan is still the second largest music market in the world, right behind the United States. So this is very notable for ethnically Korean artists who are trying to make it in Japan, right? But also Japanese artists who are coming into K-pop are treated quite differently by media and press than everyday social conversations about Japanese people in Korea are tend to play out. Having been there, I can say that there's definitely still a lot of animosity for good reason. And every once in a while, I do see that leaking into the media sphere in South Korea. I don't know if either of my fellow podcasters remember. It might have been, it was last year was when Japan entered a new era. It was like prime minister or something stepped back, and it was all that. They had a new era. It's no longer Heisei, right? It's Reiwa. Reiwa now. And there was a Japanese member of the K-pop group Twice who wrote about the changing of the era, right? And she was so excited about it, and she never mentioned Japanese emperor or the prime minister by name, never even talked about them at all. But Korean media picked that up and was like, you're speaking positively about Japan? You're a Korea hater, and we don't like you either, you know? And she had to apologize for that post. So this definitely still has a complicated and very touchy kind of landscape to navigate. I also want to mention to our viewer, Carmen, I have not heard of Mizu, but I want to look into them.
Same.
And as far as I know, like from what you say in your comment about how some Japanese literature touches upon the subject of Zainichi, but it's not like widely brought into discussion. As far as I know, it's pretty taboo. So I think that that's something that is perhaps also feeding into feelings of resentment between the two countries, is the inability to talk about respectfully the results of past actions. But I know that Chai definitely wants to jump in here. So what are your thoughts, Chai?
Yeah, I just want to it's going to be really brief because I think what you had said so far has like been a great summary. I just wanted to touch on like that same video that you were mentioning of like the Japanese younger generation, the interviewees. They were like, yeah, like we kind of know what happened, but I love K-pop. There's no animosity here, right? And it struck me a little bit because when the younger generations don't know, because like obviously we can tell. Wow, hold on, give me a quick second. Sorry, my mom was calling my brother, but the thing that's really important is like education, right? So if the younger generations are not taught the history, and obviously if they're taught it's coming from a biased perspective, and I think it's really important that, you know, the younger generations, like as much as they want to engage in K-pop, they really do have to think about the communities at large within their own country. And by not doing that, you create some sort of, I don't want to say allyship, because allyship is not the right word, but you create this sort of bond that that kind of is like a tool in a way that says, like, because I like K-pop, that means we don't have any animosity. So that means there is no actual like acknowledgement. There is no actual conversation. There is no we understand the history. We understand what we have done, even if it's like not my generation, but the older generations has done this, and this is what's feeding into the now current day interactions. I mean, so when the younger generations don't have that conversation, or not able to have that conversation, or really authentically, well, authentically is not the right word, but like really go into the history and understand the both sides, then they are going to use like things like K-pop or like K culture or, you know, K TV shows or whatever, and using that as a way to say, because I'm engaging in this culture in this way, there is no way that I could be problematic, even if I still in some form of way support a regime or I don't want to say culture, but like attitude, right? Like if younger generations are now also holding their governmental officials accountable for the ways in which they're treating other Koreans in and out of Japan, and that's going to create much more of a larger issue. And so that's one thing that I wanted to bring up, because I was kind of struck by that. Maybe I'm also, I don't want to generalize because I know generalizations can be really bad, but that particular interview with the two young girls with the interviewer kind of struck me because I hear that a lot with a lot of people, where it's like, oh, I can't be racist, or oh, I don't have a problem because I engage with it. I engage in the music. I engage with the culture. And it's like, by engaging with it doesn't necessarily mean that you're truly appreciating and understanding who they are, and not seeing the Koreans as only K-pop, for example. And then also the other thing that I wanted to add on in terms of why I think a part of the reason why a lot of people in Japan have a hard time having these conversations is this, like, Rai, I think you know, tatemae, where it's basically where they have a face that they will put on in front of everybody versus the face of that they will hold off from showing people. So it's kind of like what you would show to the outside world versus what you won't show. So like, and that also includes like thoughts, right? Like you will, if like, let's say you have something in front of you and somebody made it for you, like food, you would present it as like, oh, it tastes really good, even though inside you're like, this is disgusting, but you won't say it, right? And I think this in and of itself leads into like political conversations, where in front they're like, yeah, we're all great, we're all happy, we're all family, but inside they don't actually think that way. And sometimes it seeps a lot in the government. So I know I'm probably going to bring this up again, so sorry for the repetition, but one thing that I saw recently was that one of the governmental officials, I think it was the prime minister, who was blaming foreigners for the increase in COVID cases, even though the issue was that he was funding a program to allow people of everybody, not just foreigners, everybody to travel around Japan. And so people were using that service, and obviously the cases was rising. Both foreigners and Japanese people were telling the person, yeah, go to Japan. That was like an initiative to increase travel in Japan. And the government blame foreigners for the increases of COVID cases, where people were like, no, that's not the issue. The issue is that you have this program that is trying to incentivize people to go and travel around Japan, and because of that you have cases rising. So like things like that, where like they seep in a little bit, but it seeps in terms of marginalizing or placing blame on other people besides Japan, for example, or Japanese individuals. So that's the only thing I wanted to add on. But I know Kay wants to jump in with her thoughts, but that's what I was thinking. So thank you, Rai.
And I also just wanted to hop in from just like a musical standpoint and just like my own curiosity about Japan, because I'm very limited when it comes to Japanese culture and just my interactions with Japanese music and just cultural nuances and political. So anything that's being brought up is just like my own internal reactions based off of what my fellow podcasters are saying. However, what that reminds me of is like the initiative of like banning cultural interaction between two cultures that are or have had historical strifes between each other. And I find that to be very interesting because music, if anything, has been the tool that has been the tool to kind of unite nations or like speak on like political ideologies and things like that. And for the younger generation to kind of carry this attitude that, well, I love K-pop and I love what it does and I love how I can participate with it either just as a listener or as someone who's interested in becoming a part of this industry. I find that to be very interesting because on the flip side, where I notice it taking place in Korea, is that there's this form of like a simulation process that happens with these foreigners that come from these other Asian countries, that they have to kind of assume a role of a Korean when they're not such. And I know that's slightly different than our conversation about biracial identities within K-pop and not K-pop, but within Japan and Japanese society, but even in Korea as well, and just like being more aware of how the music industry has like opened the door for acceptance and open ideas. But I do think though that there is still this attitude that that limits that ability to like actually flourish, like for diversity and to flourish, for like acceptance and equity and social responsibility to allow others who might come from families that are multi-ethnic, like having them being able to apply to jobs outside of the creative norms or the special roles that's been assigned to them. And that's something that we talked about last week as well, that like you'll mostly see like these biracial individuals either as artists or working as English teachers or any other specific job, like even working on farms. If you're thinking about it like an agricultural sense, like these laborious type of jobs that mostly native Koreans or native Japanese people wouldn't necessarily assume those roles anymore because of their academic prowess and like their ability to have access to certain resources that these things have been limited to by have been made limited to by these individuals, based biracial individuals or multi-ethnic individuals. So I say that to say that there is still a need to have a proper discourse around how like K-pop or just like the music industry in general is being mobilized to push this needle of globalization and like diversity and acceptance, when internally there's still this kind of like I wouldn't say racist, but again, like there needs to be a conversation of race in these communities. But I do think that there is let's just say a lack of acknowledgement or lack of acceptance by these older generations, mainly because it seems like the younger generations have a little bit more respect or just like are a little bit more malleable when it comes to accepting newer ideas about the world and how we want to shape our world and how we want to shape our interactions with other groups. So I'll leave that there because I can talk about K-pop all day, but we do have an agenda that I want to respect. So I know that Rai has something that you want to add as well.
Yeah, I think that you both really raised a lot of amazing points, and I've been particularly thinking a lot about something that Chai brought up, which was this idea that in particular there may be Japanese youth, right, who look at K-pop and they say, oh, we don't have any problems because I love K-pop, right? And how that minimizes the very real conversation that has to be had about implications of history And I think that can be extended over everything. What it actually almost immediately made me think of was the discourse around cultural appropriation between like Western and Eastern, if we can even use those modalities, right? Conversations about, be it hair, be it musical stylings, any of those kind of cultural markings, and how there is often the argument that it's because I'm appreciating it, I'm invested in it, I can just be part of it. It's everything fine, and I mean, even on a very small scale, we see this in America, right? With a random white person could listen to rap and hip hop all the time, and they think suddenly it's okay to say the N-word, and they make that argument like, oh, it's in the rap songs all the time, and I love and respect X, Y, and Z. But that completely misses the larger conversation that has to be had, and lack of, I almost don't even want to say lack of education in that regard, because there's no excuse. The education is there, it's available, use it. But that can also happen when we think about K-pop and how there are Korean hip-hop artists. We even briefly touched upon the Blackpink documentary and Teddy Park, who is the music producer for Blackpink, how he's kind of bemoaning the fact that the K is put in front of all of their genres, like, oh, we're just, Korean people making music, right? But at the same time, there are interesting interactions between K-pop, K-hip hop in particular, and the American kind of hip hop society culture, right? And I think that under the guise of appreciation, a lot gets missed. And I'm kind of wondering if either of you have some. There's an example video that comes to mind regarding this issue. What's it called? Automatic. It's called Automatic is the song, right?
Was it the song that I showed y'all?
It was, I believe I showed you Chai, the
yes,
hair.
Yes, that rap ensemble.
Yeah.
However, they weren't rap. It was a conglomeration of images or aesthetics that just wasn't their own. It was blatantly obvious. Yes.
Yes. You talk about the one with the one of the guy had like the square like single braids
and skin very different than his body.
Yes.
Yes. His face is very different than his body tone.
That was atrocious. I'm sorry.
I'm trying to think. I think one of the rappers was named like Chancellor or something like that.
So let me see if I can pull it up.
But the music video was, I believe the song was called Automatic. Not to be confused with Red Velvet's Automatic, which is a timeless classic and must be respected.
Well, we could also talk about their version as well. Like, I feel like it does, in the later terms, like in a later conversation, if we want to talk about musicality and its relevance to identity, is this a true representation of R&B, or is it K-pop? And we have to like decide where it fits between those lines. But yes, sorry.
But I hope that Chai can let us know who. There's like 4 or 5 rappers.
Yeah, there was like 4. Yeah, let me see. I found the video, but they had a bunch of names. So let me see if I'm gonna like search the names on Google.
Excellent. We love Google.
So I can get the correct name
In
out.
the meantime, going back to some more of Carmen's comments here. So she says that there are quite a high amount of Japanese people complaining about how they speak Korean. Oh, like fans maybe, how they speak Korean words like oni on Japanese variety shows. Like this idea that you shouldn't speak Korean words on a Japanese variety show. Like that's how intense. Harking back to our conversation about Japan and South Korea. But I've said it once, though not on this podcast. I will say it again. Media moves fast and culture moves slow. So K-pop and all these different new emerging forms of media are definitely at least trying to push boundaries, and they definitely go much farther, I think, than the standard national conversation tends to go. And eventually that national conversation hopefully will pick up and meet media where it is. But in the meantime, you have this dissonance that I just think is so fascinating and unfortunate. I just think of the hoops that different artists have to jump through in order to avoid scandal for something that may really, from an outside perspective, be like, oh, this K-pop artist is just talking about the changing era in Japan. Why does it matter? But I understand that there's a lot of sensitivity there, and that sensitivity will remain until there's been a larger conversation. But I know that Kay wants to jump in here, so I'll let you go.
Yeah. No, I just wanted to also add on into that point in terms of how I've seen K-pop being represented in Japan as well. And I think this can definitely lead into our next conversation about simply glorifying or objectifying kind of foreignness within the industry, and how that is in turn either benefiting, if it's benefiting or is profitable, but yeah, we're still lacking a conversation, a social conversation about, okay, now that we're seeing these individuals being represented, how can we then turn other forms of media, variety shows and morning news shows and talk shows where we see different audiences interacting? How can we then turn the key and say, okay, now it's time for us to change our ideas about others and their foreignness, and actually build a community where we're accepting others. And I'll say that more so related to my experience with watching Korean variety shows and their demonstration of acceptance and having difficult conversations about race with half Korean, half whatever multi-ethnic identity they represent, also with just foreigners living in their country as well. And there are several variety shows where these individuals have the opportunity to use that platform to discuss the things that are troublesome to them and that they want to address. But I will say is that with Japan, again, my own limited understanding of Japanese culture and society, when I did visit Japan, all I saw were images of Japanese figures. So I didn't get to see the idols that everyone was talking about in their representation in day-to-day life. So you might have a poster of your favorite anime character, but you don't have a poster of your favorite K-pop idol that everyone so loves. And then also even with a representation on these fun game shows / variety shows where you have Korean idols go there. Mind you, Korean idols need to study Japanese very well in order to be considered an artist in that country. So you cannot just be a Korean idol. You have to be signed to a Japanese label in order to be promoted in that country, which I thought was pretty fascinating as well. So even the content that they produce has to be starkly different than the content that's produced in their home country. So for example, BTS, they have their own studio albums in Japanese. They have like a separate documentary in Japanese, even concert videos. It's all in Japanese, right? And these artists, BTS, they're speaking in Japanese most of the time when they're communicating with their fans. So I do think that Korean idols are operating into different, are living separate lives, or representing different worlds, because they have to juggle kind of two identities. Well, in BTS's case, three identities, because they have a profound presence in American culture, and internationally, but I think they have made a pretty great stance in their industry. Pretty great stance in their music, especially in American music industry words, because they've recently been nominated for a Grammy, and that's something that they were working towards, right? So I think they have a different level of recognition beyond their own Koreanness that is exciting, but also is this, I don't know, working against what we're talking about in terms of acceptance, because I do feel as though the only reason why, or maybe one of the main reasons why BTS is known so well is not because of K-pop, because their music has changed to fit the palettes of an international audience, where their music has to resemble something that people can relate to. And I think K-pop in itself is kind of different than that, right? Like, you have to build sort of like a taste for it. Many people who are interested in K-pop, they study Korean, then they go to Korea, and then they travel and they explore and they do all these things, and by the mode of the Hallyu wave, right? But not everyone participates in that. But that's a later conversation. I don't want to go off the handle here, but I want to go ahead and bring in some other examples of kind of the way biracial or multi-ethnic identities are represented in Korean media. And that's the only thing I'm aware of. But there are several variety shows like Hello, My Neighbor, and these sort of like slice of life type of variety shows, reality TV shows, where people will come in and submit letters of their experiences living in Korea as a non-Korean, or someone who represents themselves as half Korean and half multi-ethnic again. And so it's been an interesting experience observing these conversations, because I don't have any real example to allude to, like to bring out. But I mean, I think I can post the name of these shows in the chat and you can watch them for yourself. But the one that comes top of mind is My Friendly Neighbor Charles. And there's several, like even some Korean idols that we know today, like Somi, I don't know, Somi?
Yes, Somi.
So she is a Korean idol. I'm not sure if she's in a group or not. Please forgive me. I don't even know so much about these people.
But then IOI was like a limited time only. So now she's a solo artist.
Gotcha. I've only known her as a solo artist. But yes, that's a great background. So she was in a training company, or whatever you call it, like an agency where she had to train to become an idol. But what's interesting is that she had a video on, or an episode on, My Friendly Neighbor Charles, which I love to watch, because just to see how foreigners interact with locals living in Korea, and then like make a life there and explain how they got there, what led them there. And people have just like beautiful stories of like how they've gotten there, and just like beautiful stories of like living there, like loving to live in South Korea, and what that looks like for them, and overcoming the challenges of having to leave their home country to come to Korea for various reasons. And so I say that to say that the attitudes behind that show is kind of trying to have hosts who are actually not just only Korean. There are Korean hosts, there is an Italian host, there is a Japanese host, and sometimes I might have a special guest as well, a special host to come in and enlighten the conversation and like bring in different perspectives of like what life is like locally living in Korea. If you know, I don't know, if you think that Korea is one way, right? And I think that definitely projects this image of like globalization, that Korea is a multi-ethnic melting pot of a place that welcomes everyone. And I think they do a really good job at not only explaining the good things, but also the things that are difficult, right? Like I've had these racial encounters that weren't pleasant, and I had to teach people about how that made me feel, and how that's gonna in the future affect my children, because I am married to a native Korean here and things like that. And so it's a very tasteful show, and I hope that my viewers or people who watch us take a minute to sit down and watch this. But I think Somi had a particularly interesting opportunity to do that, because I think not only is she half white and half Korean, that was a gateway for acceptance for people that may look like her, because she kind of resembles ethnically Korean. So I think because she can eventually say, well, I am half white and I'm half Korean, you know, once she gets her fame more out there. Sorry, my words are not great today. As long as like when her fame like gets up and up, or whatever you call it, essentially. What I'm trying to say is, forgive me guys, it's been a long day. What I'm trying to say is that there is a difference in experience of people who might have a less obvious multi-ethnic background, like phenotypically. And Somi does carry that, because she definitely looks Korean. And I think that allowed her to go through many hoops that, say, a half Black and half Korean artist probably didn't have the opportunity to do the same. And so I'm saying that to say that there is still there is a need to have a conversation and have a proper dialogue about, like, doesn't matter like where my family is from, who I am, but I've made a life here, and I consider myself Korean because I have the Korean blood. Why do I have to, you know, live life with so many challenges when all I want to do is just be accepted? Like, I don't want to leave Korea. Like, I don't want to have to claim an identity of myself that I'm not 100% comfortable with yet. Like, and that's not my own choosing. And I feel like we've talked about that with Naomi Osaka, like having to choose which citizenship she wants, simply based off people's reactions to her living in Japan. And I feel like I'm going off the deep end here because I'm trying to tie in all these different examples together. But I think ultimately what I'm trying to summarize is that how can we get to a point in this conversation where we are highlighting the significance and the importance of acceptance in a way that's not coming from just a very American open-minded perspective. Like, how can we make sure that we're having a proper understanding of like the social and historical and cultural nuances that exist, and how we can tie that into what we're seeing take place within K-pop and multi-ethnic representations in K-pop, and just distorting kind of like these racial biases that exist within society. I don't know if any of my fellow podcasters want to jump in, but I feel like these different variety shows, reality TV shows, and even K-pop itself are trying to bring in a new era of kind of breaking that generational curse of like what it means to be Korean and like our national identity and acceptance. So yeah, I'm gonna stop there so I can gather my thoughts. But I do think that definitely ties into our conversation about the presence of foreigners. I'm gonna stop talking. But yes, there I go. I'm done.
I love you. I love you.
It's like I'm also kind of like interact with the chat, and then I'm like seeing our own chat. I'm like, wait, what are we talking about? Yes.
Yeah, I think our positionality is, I mean, it's not uncommon, right? In as far as like K-pop in particular is really huge in America right now. I can speak to the fact that it was getting huge before BTS came around. No shade, only facts. But I also think that you raise a really great point about how, and this is something I actually think about a lot, Americans in particular are not very well versed in the non-Western side of World War II. What was going on over with Japanese imperialism in huge swaths of Asia, right? And how that conversation has carried on after the fact is actually very different from how the conversation about Nazi Germany has taken place after the fact. I think that for what it's worth, a big part of, in particular Westerners giving their input, like, oh, you should be more accepting of X, Y, and Z. Why is this a big deal? It comes from a place of ignorance. I don't necessarily think it's malice, right? But in general, not to say, across the board, but in general, Japanese textbooks still leave out important aspects of Japanese action during World War II. There's a lot of denial of war crimes that still happens. A lot of Japanese citizens, young Japanese citizens, have no idea that comfort women were a thing, and comfort women being like a translation of, I think, the Japanese word for what was essentially sexual slavery during World War II. Not to make that too heavy, but I think that for our part here in the Western world, we definitely need to be made to understand that we don't have all of the context, and that what may feel like an overreaction from the outside actually has years, decades of weight behind it. And also there's an attempt against denial of the past. There are people who their sole goal is to make sure that these travesties of the past are remembered for what they were, and that the victims are memorialized in the way that they should be. And only then can the conversation actually go forward, right? So I definitely think that Kay raises a great point about our need for sensitivity as foreigners, outsiders, from this conversation. I also, on a lighter note, had a thought about what Kay was saying regarding the changing sound of K-pop again across different cultural landscapes. And I just find it so interesting. I'm obviously not going to speak for all Japanese individuals. I don't know that many. But a friend of mine who is from Japan, lives in Japan, we were talking about K-pop one time, and she mentioned that the K-pop songs, when they try to like transpose what was a Korean release into a J-pop song and they put the Japanese lyrics in there, apparently they're terrible. From in general, from the Japanese perspective, they don't make sense. Not that they always make sense in Korean. I'm looking at you, SM Entertainment. But I personally have found that K-pop groups who have gotten to the point where they are producing like Japanese music in like tailored to Japanese audiences, those songs tend to be a lot better and are better received. Like, I'll listen to the Japanese version of Lucifer by Shiny, However, you go into the Japanese discography there, you will find gems. 1,000 Years Always by Your Side is art. Side note, this is today, actually, December 18th, is the 3rd year anniversary of Jong Hyun's death. So I just wanted to say, may he rest in peace, and I love him. But I think that it's interesting then that we think about, BTS and how their sound has changed as they have entered the American market. And because of the cultural kind of imperialistic past of American media, right? Like we were all exports for media. We were like, we're not taking anything in. You take this to the whole world. American pop music is listened to all over the world, right? You go to Korea, yes, you hear a lot of K-pop, but you hear a lot of American pop. Whatever is on American radio, like right at that moment, you will hear it just out on the streets, blaring from shops, because they do that. And so, that's not to say that like BTS creating music that fits the American market is going to only fit the American market. It then, extends, everyone's going to be listening to it, right? But then you have to wonder if like that's the threshold that a K-pop group has to cross in order to fully achieve kind of acceptance in the American market. Then is that acceptance, right? Is that acceptance of diverse sounds and the different backgrounds of the artists? Or is that, again, that sort of culturally imperialistic tendency of like, this is what's good and you have to fit it to be successful? And I think, yes, of course, that can happen in any music market, but we as Americans are in a very particular position of having the most powerful music market in the entire world. So I don't know if anyone else has thoughts about kind of how that interaction between musical stylings and cultural tastes. Oh, sorry. Ty has just mentioned something in the chat that even when they move into new markets, they are still seen as K-pop, right? Which is so interesting because if I think about Dynamite, BTS is Dynamite, not Teo Cruz. From what was it, 2010? Still a banger. What was I saying? When I think about BTS's Dynamite, I don't think of K-pop. And I think that's because I have the perspective of being someone who was into K-pop, right? For whatever it is that K-pop is, and that's to be answered maybe never. But I don't think of K-pop at all. I think this is like the standard summer American pop hit. It reminds me a little bit of if Bruno Mars were to drop something in the middle of summer and then it's like the thing that everyone listens to, or Justin Timberlake. Like it just kind of always happens that way. And so I don't know, maybe I know that Ty is actually less invested in the K-pop scene than perhaps myself or Kay. So I'm wondering, from your perspective, Ty, does BTS still, have you even listened to Dynamite?
So that's kind of why I'm like quiet, because I haven't listened to BTS. I haven't listened to BTS in like at least a year or two. BTS fans, don't come for me. I'm not saying nothing about BTS. I'm not saying that they're bad. I saw your eyebrows, right? I'm telling you, I'm not saying anything bad, but I haven't listened to BTS at all. So I haven't heard the new song, so I don't know like what that sounds like. But but what I have heard from other individuals who are, I don't want to say get into K-pop. Like, that's not the right terminology, but when I hear it about people's reaction to BTS, there is still that they're a K-pop group, right? Like they're a Korean group who has made it to America and everybody's listening to it. And those who have not necessarily listened to K-pop in general versus those who probably weren't fans of BTS before, but because of this banging song, now they're BTS fans. But they're still seeing it under the umbrella of K-pop, but just like K-pop in America. Yeah, so like that's kind of like the discourse that I've heard. I don't know about others who are in your boat in terms of like they have been listening to K-pop, I don't say their entire life, but like longer than some of the newer generations. So like they probably are seeing that distinction. But I also wonder too, like if a Korean group goes into the Japanese market, would they lose the K and be replaced with the J? Because it's kind of like similar in this. No, because it's kind of similar in this situation where it's like they come over right to America, they adopt some of the musicalities of American pop music, and for you all, they kind of drop the K. And we're gonna get into more conversations about dropping the K. There should be a K. What's the K?
Not RK. She's staying.
Not okay. But
I'll see myself out.
No, I'm not gonna lie. I kind of got lost. I was like K, but I was like yes, K. Sorry, my brain. We love you, K. We love you. But I was thinking about that when you mentioned that, like, their BTS Dynamite is just, it's pop music, right? American pop music. So they kind of lose the K or the K-pop aspect. So I'm wondering, does that same situation, I don't know, but if that same situation could happen for Korean groups that go into Japanese markets, for example, and tailor it to not even just like in terms of like translating their already Korean songs, but actually making Japanese songs. Do they lose the K and get just like, I don't say J-pop now, but like they're part of that cultural thing? I don't know. That's what I was just thinking about. But to actually answer your question, yeah, I haven't listened to it, so I can't really tell you.
It's forgiven. I listened to it once.
I've listened to it many times. I'm kind of embarrassed. I've actually put my students on it, so it's a bop in a kindergarten classroom, but that's to say a lot, right? Like, I've also heard people who has never heard of K-pop before, and I would like play a song on a wiggle break, and they'd be like, I don't understand that. Why is that being played? Or I'll play BTS Dynamite and they can't tell the difference. And then they're same artist, like, and I'm almost wondering too, as you're saying that, Chai, about BTS, like they're recognized as K-pop, but now I kind of also see the terminology changing as, in the way that they describe their music as like just Korean boys with pop infused, Afro infused, like all these different terms that I probably wouldn't have associated with them until now, because they've hit that new market, like you were mentioning before. Yeah, global superstars, as if they're like artists of the world, and like they're not subjugated to just one type of sound. And I don't know if that's like the way I would categorize Chris Brown. Like, is he a global superstar? I don't know, but he makes hit records. He does, his music is played in many countries, but I don't think we identify him as that. However, that's neither here or there. But what I do wonder though too is that like other K-pop groups that have a very distinct K-pop sound, like let's say NCT 127, just to be specific, they have artists that they have artists that are not just Korean. They have artists that are Korean American. They have artists that are Korean Canadian, Thai, Chinese, all of that, right? And it's essentially a melting pot. And I think that's kind of the way that they've introduced themselves out into the world. However, they haven't made the same stint in the industry the way that BTS has. And is it because they're one ethnicity and it's easier to, I don't know, maybe I'm just being a little nitpicky here and like going too deep, but I'm wondering like why wouldn't a group like NCT 127 be like given a Grammy nomination for all the songs that they have that sound distinctly like K-pop, but not the same time? I don't know. I guess
I see what you get.
You see what I'm saying? Like,
I see what you kind of, yeah.
It's like, I don't know. I think, are we praising now? Like, I don't even know. Honestly, it's just something that I've been thinking about too. Say that again.
Are we praising conformity?
Right? Okay, that's the golden word, because I feel like K-pop has been seen as a commodity for so long, and like there's a special market and a niche like culture that it goes with it hand in hand, but America hasn't been able to really profit off of it until BTS was like, nah, like we make music, homie. We do our own stuff. And I'm gonna come up with a track that's fully in English just to let you know we're deadly serious about this. And that's why they've been able to be categorized as, like you said, global superstars. Whereas like you will never see Chris Brown come out with a song in Spanish or in Arabic or in Chinese. You know what I'm saying? It's like my mind is like thinking about, like you said, conformity. Like BTS has conformed their sound to a way that's palatable to a global world, whether that be in Korean or not. Maybe their true fans will constantly listen to the Korean, you know, but the newer fans, the people that are kind of like pushing them, applying that pressure, are regular people that are like, I want to hear your music on the radio. Like, okay, BTS is on the radio. Like, do they have songs that are like allowed to be on the radio? Like, I haven't heard the Korean version of their album, like, or their songs on the radio. I've only ever heard their English versions. Like, I'm saying that for Mic Drop. I'm saying that for Dynamite. And there's another song that they have an English version for. The one with Halsey.
Boy with Love?
Yeah, Boy with Love. Yes. There is some Korean in it, but it's like 80-20%. 80% English, 20% Korean. And they began to dilute it a little bit more and more and more, where people are asking for more music by them that's in English.
Mm-hmm.
So to tie that in back to like their objectification across the entire world, them being Korean men that are, you know, now commodities of K-pop when they're no longer K-pop. I don't even know if I want to say that. I'm kind of scared, but you know what I'm trying to say. It's like,
right.
I'm trying to be careful because, again, this is a new concept for me, and I'm learning about it as I'm talking about it. But I'm curious about everyone else's thoughts. Would you now change your categorization of BTS? Like, are they still K-pop or not? And yeah.
Well, I mean, loaded question. I'm gonna go for a short answer now. And we have to go.
I'm gonna go for a short answer now, and then I'm gone.
There are some people who have said from the moment BTS got big that BTS was not K-pop because they're bigger than K-pop, they're BTS pop. Wait, hold on. Let me take a break. Let me take a breath.
BTS pop?
It's not accurate. via like any measuring of anything. And even if we were going to talk about K-pop artists doing Americanized sounds, Big Bang was first. At the same time, so like I would never call BTS not K-pop because of their success on the global scene. Rather, I would say certain songs of theirs are not K-pop because of the way that they're marketed. And so at the same time, I wouldn't be like, oh, you're a K-pop artist doing non-K-pop music, It's like there's importance in acknowledging the foundations of what K-pop is, and a large part of that is the trainee process, and which they went through, and that starting point, right, that is relatively new on the global media scene, and so that, yeah, Dynamite sounds like American pop, but I wouldn't say that because Dynamite's like, because it sounds like American pop, I might be like, it's like American pop. I wouldn't say it like is necessarily, only because from my personal standpoint right now, I feel like that K and K-pop has a lot of power, that can be utilized on the global scene, right? And if a group wants to drop that for themselves and they would prefer to never be referred to as K-pop ever again, I mean, sure, but I've also talked about my opinion about pop punk artists being like, we're not pop punk, we're just punk. Like, it's a good thing. I like pop punk. Side note, before we swoosh away, Cherry Bomb deserves a Grammy nomination, for many reasons. That song is an experience. NCT should have a Grammy nomination. You are right. You raise a great point. Kind of a joke, but also jopping by Super M. Because if we're talking cultural impact,
right?
New words. I don't know what y'all think about that.
I'm not trying to knock BTS from their high. I'm
There's
so
room for one more,
right,
or more.
I'm so happy for them. Like, I'm so proud that they even got this far to like be nominated. Mm-hmm. But were they nominated on the grounds of them being like true K-pop artists, that remained with their sound? I know we don't want to belabor this conversation because we do got to wrap up, but I'm just wondering, curious K over here, just wondering about these things, because I feel like it's like now coming to a conversation about authenticity, which we'll hit on very soon, about like cultural authenticity, musical authenticity as well. So Chai, take it away.
I know Rai is gonna wrap us up, but I just wanted to also add, I'm not gonna add too much. Hopefully it's gonna be like 2 sentences, but like I agree about, like you have BTS becoming like these global superstars, and these have all these other groups that are dropping bombs, right? They're dropping great songs. But I think I think what we can start off with next conversation is about like what is truly K-pop, because I'm hearing a lot of like there are some differentiations. There are some differences in some of these groups, but it was also like thinking about like, do these groups have the ability, the capability to market their songs in a way that that BTS was able to do it, or has the stardom of BTS that has grown has given a new way. I'm not saying that they're the pioneers, but have they given a new way for newer people to access K-pop in a way that may not have been on that such large of a scale. And so I wonder, even though BTS right now is like, you know, producing these English songs or songs in English, I wonder if I know Kay was talking about, like, you know, them dropping the Korean language, but I wonder if there's going to be a way or some sort of recognition or something that happens, I don't know, that allows like Korean artists or groups to also infiltrate, come into the American market, but still still keep their Korean language, even if it's still dropping some of it or adding, I don't know, but I'm just wondering, like, because I don't think BTS is going to be the last group, because we also got, like, we haven't even talked about like Blackpink and their role in all of this as well, because they're not as large as BTS, but they are large. It's kind of like BTS and Blackpink. That's kind of how I'm hearing these two groups. But I wonder if, as they're rising, and maybe if they do collaborations with other groups, I don't know, something could happen where K-pop becomes, I don't want to say mainstream, but they start hitting the markets in a way that, for example, Ailey couldn't have done with her song, which I love Ailey, but I don't know what that song was. I think it was like Falling Back or something like that. I don't know. That song, I love her, but that...
Respect to Ailey, but...
Respect. Love her to death. I don't think that... I'm glad she left that company, because that company... That song was... whew. But something like that, you know, like something where, you know... Yeah, I'm gonna stop there. So like Riley can wrap it up, because I don't want to drag the conversation. But
I think that we're so tired that we're really letting our guards down. We're just saying things. Woo! Okay. Yes. That's a great conversation for our next podcast episode on Friday, 5:30 every week. Oh my God, next Friday is Christmas. I don't know what y'all are doing. We'll let you know if we'll be here.
drinking eggnog.
I mean, like, I'm good to be here, but
we don't do nothing.
Some horchata for me.
It's a pandemic. Where are we gonna go?
To my bed.
Also, disclaimer from myself. I'm not a BTS auntie. Respect to BTS. They have done things. Yes.
Yes, they have. Yes, they have.
Don't kill me. It's difficult for me to disengage my analytical brain from my let's enjoy things and talk about nice stuff brain. So sometimes analysis is the nice stuff. So on that note, I want to thank, oh, I'm so sorry for that. I would like to thank Carmen for all of the comments. You've actually filled in a lot of gaps for me personally. I love the perspective that you've been able to give, and thank you for anyone else who might have been watching. And please make sure that you like this video and subscribe, and we will probably see you next week. Maybe not you guys, but we'll be here probably. All right. Bye, y'all.